Ohio State, Indiana, by the numbers. Glad you could join us for the best in discussion, debate, and analysis right here at the Voice of College Football. Don't forget to like the video and subscribe. Ohio State, Indiana, the big showdown in Columbus. Buckeyes 9-1. Indiana, an unfamiliar 10-0 for the first time in school history. The Buckeyes have won 29 consecutive games in the series. They are 30-1 against Indiana dating back to 1988. And Ohio State has outscored IU by a mere 670 points during that span. I did the math myself. None of that matters, though, when the two line up at the Horseshoe on Saturday. Let's match up the two versus three common opponents, and let's also keep in mind that they will play two other common opponents after their matchup as Indiana finishes up with the old Oak and Bucket game against Purdue, and Ohio State plays the game against Michigan. Also keep in mind that these teams would have played far more common opponents in the past because they played together in the Big Ten Eastern Division. Therefore, they would have played the other 5 teams in the division, plus they would have had most likely crossover games against the Big Ten Western Division. But it's only Michigan State, Nebraska, and Northwestern to compare by the numbers. The Buckeyes beat Michigan State 38-7 to open up Big Ten play back on September 28th. Aiden Childs and Michigan State made some plays in the first half, but it was Ohio State's red zone defense that kept them largely out of the end zone. Jeremiah Smith made one of those spectacular one-handed catches that he likes to do, and the Buckeyes obviously routed Michigan State in the second half after leading by 10 at halftime. They had 10 more first downs than Sparty, outgained them on the ground by 138 yards, by 99 through the air. Ohio State enjoyed a decided average per rush margin of 3.4, but they were outgained through the air by a half yard per pass by Michigan State, +2 in the turnover category. And Ohio State certainly much better on third and fourth down efficiency at 11 of 21 versus Michigan State's 2 of 10. Indiana was less than a 10-point favorite when they traveled to East Lansing on the first weekend of November. And of course, this was the first time all season that Indiana trailed in a game by 2 scores, 10-0, but then they roared back with 47 consecutive unanswered points. Amari Farrell with 2 interceptions for the IU defense, which ranks top 5 in the country right now. Curtis Rourke fired 4 touchdown passes. Michigan State was held to negative 36 yards on the ground. Of course, that includes sacks, as IU completely dominated this game. Almost 5 more yards per carry on the ground and almost 2 yards per pass play by Indiana over Michigan State. The turnover margin in the Hoosiers' favor. Everything in the Hoosiers' favor as they rolled in this one, although they did only go 33% on third and fourth down conversions, and Michigan State right about at that rate, 6 of 19, but it did not matter as Indiana won 47-10. The Buckeyes served up their sloppiest performance of the season by far at the Horseshoe against Nebraska. They trailed in the fourth quarter 17-14 before putting together a touchdown drive and a goal line stand to defeat Nebraska 21-17. For the Buckeyes in this one, the stats do not look pretty. Injuries and poor play diminished the Ohio State offensive line going into this game by far. This was just an atrocious performance by especially the left side of the line, and just completely crippled the Ohio State offense as they were outgained by 57 yards on the ground. And the defense did the job against the Huskers' rushing attack, so it was not the defense, but it was solely the offense couldn't run the ball. About 2.5 yards per carry out of Travion Henderson and Quinshon Judkins. They outpassed Nebraska, but just by 69 yards. And the yards per play, though, Ohio State just didn't have the ball much of the time because the offense couldn't stay on the field. But when they did, they hit for explosive plays, almost 14 yards per pass play, and outgaining Nebraska by almost 10 yards per play. And the Buckeyes bad on third and fourth down at 2 for 12, but the defense held up its end in this narrow win against Nebraska. Now, these matchups against Nebraska serve as the most valid comparison between the two teams against the common opponent because Nebraska probably the best of the 3 teams, but more so, these games were back-to-back. So 1 week earlier, Then the Ohio State struggle against the Huskers. Of course, Indiana demolished Nebraska at home. And this was a game that going into this matchup, we were trying to figure out if either one of these teams was legit, as Nebraska came in at 5-1 on October 19th. Nebraska has not recovered. Curtis Rourke fired on 17 of 21 passes, but missed the second half with a hand injury. But Indiana was still not denied. That's how much superior they were, even though they had to play Taven Jackson, their backup quarterback, in the second half. They rushed for 215 yards in this game, 6.5 yards per carry. And again, contrast that with the Ohio State effort on the ground against Nebraska, which was basically non-existent. Indiana outrushed Nebraska by 145 yards, were +4 in the turnover margin, and went 6 of 11, plus 50% on 3rd and 4th down, while the defense held Nebraska to just 33% conversions on 3rd and 4th down. Ohio State took on Northwestern at Wrigley Field last weekend. It was a pretty ho-hum effort by the Buckeyes, winning 31-7. The defense looked bad the first two series as the Wildcats drove down the field. Then Jack Sawyer made a play on the first drive, causing a fumble on Jack Lausch inside the 15-yard line. But then the Wildcats completed the touchdown drive the second time they had the ball and led 7-0. The Buckeyes had a 4th down conversion at midfield. Otherwise, Northwestern would have had the ball with a touchdown lead late in the first quarter, but the Buckeyes would not be denied, and they steamrolled from there, outgaining Northwestern on the ground by 123 yards, more than 3.5 yards per carry, more than 4.7 yards per pass play, and the Buckeyes again won comfortably 31-7. Indiana's win against Northwestern, very different in a sense, although they won by a similar margin, 17 points. Curtis Rourke threw for 380 yards. Elijah Surratt had a huge day on the receiving end with a $135. IU's pass defense, so susceptible against Jack Lausch, Bryce Kurtz, and A.J. Henning for Northwestern. The passing game kept the Wildcats in the game at 17-10 at the break. We see that Indiana outgained Northwestern by 56 yards on the ground, 137 through the air. And again, the teams were about even in 3rd and 4th down efficiency. As mentioned off the top, Ohio State has yet to play Michigan. Indiana, with its biggest scare of the season against Michigan at home, they jumped out to a 17-3 lead, hit Michigan with some big pass plays. However, the offense non-existent, and they were dominated up front by the Wolverines in the second half. Indiana ran 25 plays in the second half against Michigan for 18 yards. And of course, the Buckeyes showdown with Michigan's in 2 weeks. Both teams also play Purdue. Of course, that's the old Oak and Bucket game for Indiana-Purdue on the final weekend of the season. The Buckeyes demolished Purdue 45-0. Add it all up against Michigan State, Nebraska, and Northwestern, it looks like this. Indiana outscored the three by 103 points. The Buckeyes largely on the struggle against Nebraska, compared to Indiana's demolition of Nebraska, only outscored these three by 20 points per game. First downs, Indiana plus 19, and again, Ohio State suffers in this comparison category because of the Nebraska game, only plus 5. Rushing offense, Indiana plus 359, Ohio State 204. Passing, Indiana and Ohio State virtually even in their advantage versus these three teams. In rushing yardage per carry, Indiana significantly better versus these three than Ohio State. The passing edge goes to Ohio State by 0.6 yards per pass. Indiana took care of the football better, plus 6, and Ohio State at plus 3. The 3rd and 4th down percentages you see right there are fairly even, as that was consequential in both of these teams, largely dominating these three opponents, especially Indiana, of course, as Ohio State struggled against Nebraska. And again, they were more successful on 3rd and 4th down than their opponents. What does it all mean? It means Ohio State, Indiana are substantially better than Michigan State, Nebraska, and Northwestern, unless they happen to be struggling along the offensive line, i.e., Ohio State against Nebraska, or Indiana against Michigan. Those were close games, of course, for both of these teams. Indiana, Ohio State, it should be a fun one in Columbus on Saturday. My prediction later in the week for our folks on patreon.com/MarkRogersTV and also as a premium YouTube member right here at the Voice of College Football. See you next time.